Hello, Year 11. So, next up, question 4 should be your third question and should take you approximately 30 minutes. Absolutely no more to complete. But remember, we really are trying to get high marks in this question. So it's worth taking the time. You can actually hear my mum's dog snoring in the background. So if you can hear like a strange snorting, it is my mum's chihuahua. I'm really sorry. So, first things first, let's look at the question 4. So always start in the same way. It says, focus this part of your answer on the second part of the source from line 21 to the end. That's pretty typical. It's usually the second half. So find line 21 and draw your line, separating it out so you know where to focus your attention. And it's really important that you only look at the correct part of the source because you won't get any credit for anything that is above it. And then look at the statement. So a student, having read his section of the text, said, the writer makes the narrator seem hopeless and lonely. So take those keywords out. It is as if she is sharing a secret with the reader. So you've got 3 focuses there, which is really helpful. It's going to give you lots to talk about. Remember, you need to refer to all of the focuses within the question, so you need to be careful to dissect it well. So you've got your focuses, you've got your line number. First things first, read through and highlight and annotate any evidence that shows that the narrator seems hopeless, lonely, is sharing a secret, or which contradicts that statement, because the most important thing with this question is that you develop an opinion. So give yourself 2 minutes, off you go. Okay, so let's have a look at that extract and see what we can pull out of it. So start from the top. No guns though, even they could not be trusted with guns. Guns were for the guards, specially picked from the angels. The guards weren't allowed inside the building, except when called, and we weren't allowed out, except for our walks twice a day 2 by 2. So I've circled 2 by 2. I'm thinking loneliness. Okay. So yeah, all right, that could suggest they are a bit lonely. They certainly don't have free will. They have to go in pairs, so it's not like you have an overwhelming sense of community. But maybe you could start to form a bit of an argument there. It's not like they're completely isolated. Okay, around the football field, which was enclosed now by a chain link fence topped with barbed wire. So you could then argue that's what keeps them isolated from the real world. That could be creating a sense of loneliness. I don't think that's where I'm going to go though. The angels stood outside it with their backs on us. They were objects of fear to us, but of something else as well. So I sort of looked at the word objects and, that they are objectified. But then actually I think the word something is more important. Something else. Like, you can't quite put your finger on what. And I wonder if what they are is maybe an object of hope. And that idea has come from the next sentence. So if only they would look, if only we could talk to them. You've got a couple of things here. So you've got that repetition of if only, that sort of sense of longing. I think that shows that they have hope still. On one hand, it's like desperation. Maybe hope is starting to fade. But equally, whilst they're still thinking of solutions, I think there is still hope. And then you've got these pronouns. You've got if, you've got we and they. And the way those sentences follow, I think, connects the two as if it is the angels that they believe are maybe the key to their freedom, if only they could connect with them. Okay, if only we could talk to them. Something could be exchanged, we thought, made some deal made, some trade-off. We still had our bodies. That was our fantasy. So then I've looked at the word fantasy because I'm thinking again about that idea of hope, but also confessional. Okay, fantasy is sort of an imagined reality that you understand is improbable. And don't always share that with everybody, but this is being shared with the reader, so that feels quite personal. Also could show that maybe, that hope is fading because a fantasy is something that is improbable. They don't expect it to come true. I got this final paragraph. So, we learned to whisper almost without sound. In the semi-darkness, we could stretch out our arms when the aunts weren't looking and touch each other's hands across the space. So I've highlighted that because I think that could suggest loneliness, because it's like they're so desperate for a personal connection that they are taking risks. Got that embedded clause to remind us that they aren't allowed that physical closeness. They're breaking a rule. They're having to take a risk, stretching out. If you're stretching out, if you get caught, it's not a discrete action. It requires a bit of effort. Okay, and so that could show that they're lonely, that this sort of physical closeness that they crave is strictly prohibited. We learn to lip read, our heads flat on the beds turned sideways, watching each other's mouths. In this way we exchange names, from bed to bed. Alma, Janine, Dolores, Moira, Jean. And I've highlighted this list of names. There's a few things there. They're fragments, and I think that emphasises an idea of separation. It keeps each name sort of physically separated on the page, emphasising their separation within their situation and therefore potentially loneliness. But also, you could argue, I think, that, there's 5 names straight away, that these girls aren't in it alone. There is a collective. They have got a group. And despite all the rules and the stricture, they are finding that togetherness. And I think we can see that through the constant use of these collective pronouns. We, us, there we go. But then you can go back the other way again and say, well, yeah, that is possibly the case. However, they've had to take real risks to learn those names, even though they are able to go out 2 by 2. So there is this sort of real contradiction between the loneliness based on what they're allowed, but the togetherness that they find despite it. Okay, it's quite confusing. I think this is a very difficult extract. Also, the language isn't as rich, I think, as we might hope for this question. So then that brings us to planning. So remember, when you do this question, you are looking for 4 paragraphs. How do we remember 4? Well, it's question 4. We always write the amount of paragraphs that mirrors the question number if we have the time. I think it's always good to go for a firstly, additionally, however, and end with nonetheless. So you have an overall argument, but you play devil's advocate at one point as well. Also, you need to decide to what extent you agree. That's the first thing you should do. So decide on a bit of a sliding scale, how much do you agree with strongly agree at one end, strongly disagree at the other. Okay, so how much do you agree? Agree. You want plus an adverb. Okay, so don't just say I agree or I disagree. You strongly, you somewhat, you know, neither agree or disagree if you want, but you need to come up with your perspective. They want to hear your personal response. You're allowed to disagree, but you have to have good reasons. And then come up with your 4 things that you'll talk about. And if I were you, I'd be using these as starting points. So do you think they're hopeless? Yes or no? Do you think they're lonely? Yes or no? And why? Does it seem like she's sharing a secret with the reader? Yes or no? And why? Okay. So once you've gone through and you've annotated, that's when you should plan out your answer. And I think you can take about 2 to 3 minutes to do that. So I'll give you 3 minutes. See what you come up with. Off you go. I hope you got on all right with those plans. Here is what I did. So I've decided I somewhat agree with the statement. I don't agree with it entirely. I think there are arguments for and against, and that I have planned for here in my planning. So what I've done, I've highlighted those pronouns to develop me through my argument. I've added in an extra one. I've added in a what's more, because I would put my however in with my additionally, because I think there's 2 ways of viewing my evidence. for that second point. So for my next paragraph, I'm going for a what's more because it's actually developing the end of that second paragraph. And you can play with these pronouns if you get a statement that feels like it's actually a very balanced, you're neither here nor there in terms of your opinion. If I'm honest, I think the likelihood is that you're going to get a statement that you're going to agree with. That's normally likely. And so that, however, there will probably only be 1 point, but you just don't know. And what I've also done is I have highlighted those keywords from the question. I've made sure that every single one is referred to. So I've got lonely, lonely, hope, confessional, linked to it being a secret that is being shared. So I'm making sure I'm covering all the bases. That's what the examiner will expect from a higher mark answer, that you have interacted with all parts of the statement. So I'll talk you through what I have planned for. You can use my plan if you want. You can jot it down now as you go, or you can use your own one. I will say it again. I don't expect you to read my mind. I want you to have your own opinions, your own ideas. I've gone for firstly, yes, they do seem lonely because they are taking risks for human contact. That's the first point I would make. I'd say additionally, yes, they do seem lonely because they are clearly kept deliberately isolated. And that's when my however would come in, because I say, however, despite the fact that they are deliberately isolated, they do seem to find one another despite those constraints and have developed that togetherness and that sort of sense of community. It's probably essential for them retaining hope, which I'd come to next. Because I actually think that they do have hope, because they've imagined how those angels could possibly help, obviously in this fantasy world that they don't really believe will come true, but still they've allowed themselves to imagine. But nonetheless, I think despite either perspective, I think what is without doubt is that it does have a confessional tone. It's written in first person. We're getting a direct insight into the narrator's memories, but also through that the narrator is admitting which rules were broken, something that possibly wouldn't have been done previously because it would have got her into trouble. Once that plan is complete, you need to write your introduction, and in your introduction you just need to write a sentence or two clarifying your perspective. Do you agree to what extent do you agree or disagree with the statement? 1 minute, off you go. Hopefully you've gotten off to a good start there. I'm going to talk you through my introduction. So with your green pen, just make sure you've got the right components to it. Like I say, the wording doesn't need to be the same, of course not. So firstly, you should have your statement of agreement. So I somewhat agree with the student. You just have to make sure that you have stated how much you agree with that initial statement. With some kind of adverb, I think, is better. So check you've done that. And then the next is making sure you're explaining to what degree you agree with the different parts of the statement. So I've put, the extract does seem confessional, as though the narrator is sharing a secret. So I've highlighted there that first focus I've taken from the student. And there is some suggestion that she is lonely. Highlighted again that other keyword. However, there is, a bit repetitive there, there is some suggestion, again, that a community has been established and that hope is not lost. So it's just about getting the keywords from the question in and your statement of agreement. Once you have done that, you can move on to your first Peter die plus paragraph. I say plus, remember, because you want to try and give more than one bit of evidence, being aware that you do only have 5 minutes per paragraph. And you want to start your paragraph with firstly. So use your plan, use your annotations, 5 minutes, off you go. So here is my first paragraph. I'll talk you through it. You can use your green pens. If you've used my plan, probably a bit easier. You can see how I have interpreted that. If you've used your own, not a problem. Just again, checking that you have done as much with it as possible and have incorporated all of the necessary parts. So I have labelled where the Peter die bits are. I've highlighted that key word from the statement, and I have highlighted where I've used my sentence starters. So I've gone firstly, so there's that first connective. Firstly, the writer does seem to suggest that the narrator is lonely. This is demonstrated by the description of the way the narrator seeks physical contact. In the semi-darkness, we could stretch out our arms when the aunts weren't looking and touch each other's hands across the space. So there's my point and there's my evidence. The technique I'm starting with is the embedded clause. So the embedded clause obviously being that when the aunts weren't looking. The use of the embedded clause acts as an aside, reminding the reader that any closeness is forbidden. That's my first sort of explanation, if you like, and then I'm going on to the die, and to die I'm going to zoom, and that's where my second technique comes in. So I've gone for the verb stretch, means to reach out as far as you can in an intentional way. The impression I get, this creates the impression that the narrator deliberately seeks out the other girl's hand in what we imagine would be an obvious way. And the effect, what effect does that have on the reader? What does it lead them to infer? So this leads the reader to infer that the girls are so deprived of physical interaction that they will risk the aunts catching them in order to feel like they aren't alone. Now, I'm pretty much referring straight back to the end here. I've put in another quote to develop it, but actually I'm referring back to my point straight away. So whilst this does suggest loneliness, you could also argue that as the writer never mentions them being caught, that actually the girls successfully gained togetherness despite the constraints in place, something arguably supported by the writer's frequent use of the collective pronouns we and us. So I have put another couple of quotes in, but without lots and lots of development, partly because of time, but also because this isn't a very language-rich piece, I don't think. There's not lots of metaphors or things to comment on. Okay, so have a look at your own, make sure you've got all of those Peter die aspects in, that you have done as much as possible with the language that you have identified as interesting, and then move on to your second paragraph, another 5 minutes. in my second paragraph, hopefully what you will see is once again I have labelled the different components, highlighted those sentence starters, the references to the writer so that we are keeping focused on the fact that this is a fictional construct and all decisions are deliberate, and I have highlighted that keyword from the question, in this case loneliness and lonely. There we go. So once again, yours doesn't have to be word for word what mine is, but hopefully it will show you how you could develop an idea so you can check your own work. Have you managed to incorporate the things that are going to get you the marks? So there's my connecting statement. What's more, the writer confirms the narrator's potential loneliness, keyword from the question, by suggesting that each of the girls is isolated. So that's how the writer's created that impression. This is demonstrated in the final line when the writer lists the girls. So that's what the writer has done deliberately. And then I've got my quote, Alma, Janine, Dolores, Moira and Jean. The use of fragments. So I've already sort of mentioned a technique, it's a list, but then to make it more specific and something I can analyse, I've gone for fragments. Here, not only highlights the girls as individuals rather than a collective, but also creates separation between them, mirroring the separation described by the narrator. So here, I've gone for my second E because actually what I've done, there's nothing in there, they're just proper nouns. I can't analyse those, but what I can do is see what the effect of the technique is. So E, effect of the technique. And then I've gone straight to my art, refer to another example, because I can't do any more analysis with that. So this is further emphasised by the earlier mention of the girls being allowed to go on walks 2 by 2. Okay, so you might say, well, how is that going to prove their loneliness? Well, this is where you can have a little bit of a debate and where this structure can become a bit more fluid so that you can be a bit more interesting. So the word to means that the girls were not forced to be alone. So I haven't gone for a literal definition. I've gone for the definition, what it means within the text, or contextualised it. And this creates the impression, so still impression I, that they had the opportunity to build friendships, thus ridding them of loneliness. Okay, so that seems to contradict my previous point. And that's where I brought in the however. As the narrator had to learn the other girls' names through lip reading, so I've put in another quote, we can infer, so on that sort of effect on the reader, what does the reader therefore learn? That conversation was also prohibited, and that despite there being many girls, the writer intends to present them as lonely. So I've kept it there on the writer's intention. Okay. Paragraph 3 now, 5 minutes. Off you go. next up, paragraph 3. And before I go through this, just a little side note that my correction of separation was wrong. It was right in the first place. I altered an accurate spelling, so there's a lesson in that. Don't doubt yourself, guys. I was right to begin with. It shouldn't be an E, it is an A. Anyway, I'm sure you don't care as much as I do about that. So moving on. Paragraph 3. This is my however. So this is where I'm starting to disagree with the statement a little bit. So remember, the statement suggests there is no hope. But I'm claiming actually there is. And so I've gone for my however. What seems without question is that the writer, kept us focused on the writer, presents the narrator as having some faint hope. So coloured in there, hope, to show that I'm referring back to the keywords in the question all the way through. I've acknowledged that it's not an overwhelming sense of hope, but it's there. Carrying on, highlighting where I'm using the framework. This is demonstrated when the writer, that should be boxed in, the writer states that the angels were not only objects of fear, but also something else as well. The word I'm going for there is something. So on to my technique. The word is fine in this case. The word something means, so straight into my die, I'm not going to go in with any effect of that technique because that becomes more interesting when you go through the die process in this case. The word something means an indeterminate, unspecified thing. This creates the impression that the narrator doesn't know exactly what the something is, but the writer's inclusion of it means it is significant. That's the impression that we get. And the effect, well, it leads us to infer. So the writer leads us to infer that something could be hope, especially as it is followed by the repetition of if only. Okay, so I'm bringing in my second quote here. So here I'm going straight to my refer to another example. This shows that the narrator longs for a scenario where the angel's behaviour alters, suggesting that this could lead to a change and indicating a remote sense of hope. So my refer at the end ends on the same topic as the point, hope, that keyword from the question. So well done if you've managed to get those 3 paragraphs all done within 15 minutes. 5 more minutes now, try and get a final paragraph done, and then that will have been your 20 minutes up, and you'll have done a really great job. Well done. final paragraph. Well done if you've stuck with it all the way. Great job. Really glad you are doing this prep task really, really well. So let's just talk through again. Same components. I've labelled again the P to die process. Start with that connective, so nonetheless. So it's taking us back to our overwhelming viewpoint. So our overwhelming viewpoint is one of agreement. So the overwhelming tone of the extract is confessional, leading me to agree that it is like a secret being shared. I've highlighted secret being shared because that is the wording from the question, it's the keywords. The writer, I've highlighted that direct reference to the writer, which you should keep making, sets this tone by writing in first person. That's my first bit of evidence, but I can't do a lot with that, so I need to go on and quote, and confirms it by sharing the narrator's thoughts and fantasy. And there is my quotation, there is my evidence. And I'm going straight into the technique, the abstract noun fantasy, and then straight into the die process. Means to imagine improbable things. There's our definition. And then I'm going to go to the effect. Improbable things, which not only diminishes the aforementioned sense of hope, but also allows the reader an insight into the narrator's desires, which is often something only shared with people close to us. Okay, this is sort of the effect here. Then I've gone to my further emphasise. Should have put the R there. There's my refer to a secondary example. So this is further emphasised in the final paragraph, where the writer focuses the reader on the list of activities that the narrator undertook under semi-darkness. So I've included a quote there to show it's all linked into the text. The darkness is a time when things are more easily concealed due to the inability for humans to see well. There's my definition of that word. This creates the impression, say my eye, that few people would have known about the lip reading, etc. that took place, leading the reader, the E, to infer that the writer has shared a secret with them. The effect on the reader at the end linked into the writer, and I've got the keywords from that question. So I really hope you found that helpful and that you are working through this prep. Remember now, it is a week today, not very long left. I will update a video on question 3 because I know that's one you find really difficult. I'm not sure, it might be a little later today, but it might not be now till Friday, so I'll try my best, but it will get up there at some point. Okay, thank you for watching.